Okay, back again. Greetings to all. Welcome to the halfway point in the semester. We are over halfway through the number of reading quizzes, but in terms of dates and weeks and such, we're halfway through. Congratulations for making it this far. Hopefully you've learned a little bit of something. So this section of the course is pretty quick, just one chapter from the Lowy textbook on public opinion in the media. I have a fewer number of slides, but this is a topic that I take great interest in, so I might go a little over half an hour. I hope not to, but we'll see. So the 16th edition of the chapter opens with a vignette on Greta Thunberg, the Swedish climate change activist, but the previous edition opened with a photo and brief discussion of the March for Our Lives movement, which, of course, began after the February 2018 shooting at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida. March for Our Lives was formed by survivors of that attack as a public opinion group, if you will, whose goal was to get gun control legislation passed. The group has not been as directly successful as its founders, I'm sure, envisioned it in 2018, that it would be in years in the future. And I'll explain a little bit as to why that is the case momentarily. But anyway, I left this in here because I feel like this is an important movement. Not that Greta Thunberg and the public opinion for climate change legislation isn't, but anyway, just to give you both in the text and in the slides. Broadly, what is public opinion? It's citizens' attitudes about things political, right? Issues, leaders, institutions, events, what have you. We could look at it in one of two ways. We could look at public opinion of the individual, what one person thinks about political issues, leaders, institution, events. Or we look at it in the aggregate, which is normally what we do with data, right? You can find the public opinion of an individual by talking about politics with your friends and neighbors and family and such. In the aggregate, this is usually what we see in polling data, or an election can be an indicator of aggregate public opinion, town meetings, protests, and so on, right? Any time that people collectively get together to express their opinion, we can use that as a gauge or a guide, however unscientific and imperfect it might be. Ultimately, though, scientific or not, however we consider preferences, beliefs, and choices of voters, these things should matter to policymakers, right? Policymakers, which is to say politicians, people holding elected office, should listen to what people have to say beyond election day, right? That's my take on things as your friendly neighborhood political scientist. But anyway, let's think more a bit about our preferences and beliefs, right? Preferences are often shaped by economic self-interest and social or moral values. Some preferences may be held more intensely than others, right? You might have strong feelings about abortion. You might be pro-choice. But you also might be very concerned about the federal debt and deficit, and thus you might put economic interests before your moral values. It might be the other way around. That's up to each individual, and there's no right combination here. But the fact of the matter is sometimes we're concerned about the bottom line, and sometimes we're not. But beliefs reflect how we understand the world around us and the consequences of our actions and of the actions of government. The choices presented to us do not always yield a clear measure of our preferences or beliefs. This is especially acute at election time. I really think going back to the 2016 election, since there was no incumbent president running for office, both the Democratic and Republican fields were pretty open, although it looked early on that Hillary Clinton was the favorite. The Republicans were more wide open than that, and the choices that came about through the primary election process gave us two choices in the two-party system that we have. There are more parties that run and have candidates, but really two viable options really were not the favorite. Neither was the favorite of either party. So sometimes what options were given to choose between or among are not always what we would hope for or what might always be the best, right? Which again is why it's important to consider public opinion beyond election time, because election time sometimes isn't the best indicator of what people want, right? Let's think about these important terms here. Self-interest, the desire that government actions better our lives, right? That's kind of what we aim for, right? Is our financial and social well-being are shaped by government policies, whether we like it or not. Our values are our philosophies about morality and justice and how they impact our opinions and may even contradict our economic interests. Again, I gave that example on the previous slide, but usually economic interests drive our day-to-day decision-making, but our values and questions of morality can sometimes supersede our economic interests. We can also consider how our social group or our identity might influence our opinion on things political. Our family, community, language, race, ethnicity, religion, all of these impact our opinions, and I'll talk at differing lengths about all of these variables throughout the slides here. Let's consider social origins of preferences, right? Our preferences are developed through our social lives, our upbringing, where we go to school, our religion, and our experiences. We call this process political socialization. Hopefully you've heard this term before. Maybe if you've taken, intro to sociology or I don't know what other class, maybe anthropology, you might hear the term, but socialization is this process through which we all undergo as children, and we continue to undergo it into adulthood. It's our induction into political culture, right? It's the process of learning the underlying beliefs and values on which the political system is based, right? And I'm not talking necessarily about, how you became a Republican or how you became a Democrat necessarily, but I mean, there are bigger pictures of socialization that no matter what your political leanings, despite the political divisions in the United States at present or in recent decades, there are things that we are all socialized to embrace. Democracy, nominally, broadly. Capitalism, nominally, broadly, for whatever reason, good or bad. We all stand up for the national anthem, most of us at a sporting event or what have you. These are all forms of socialization, right? It's how we think about the world around us, what we do, how we interact with the political world. We're taught to be very patriotic in this country, for better or for worse. And how we reach these conclusions are shaped by various what we call agents of socialization. That begins with the family, right? Most of us probably share the same political outlook and voting habits as our parents, right? That's not everyone, but it's most of us, right? Our family, our parents, our extended family tend to influence how we view the world. This then continues at school and throughout, K through 12, college and beyond. Schooling and your education is in effect an agent of socialization, and that could be broad, like in elementary school. We all get up and we say the Pledge of Allegiance every day. This is meant to make us good little U.S. citizens, but then it can continue beyond that. Again, K through 12 and into college. I have different political leanings now than I did when I was a senior in high school, and I did vote that year. I was 18, so it's an ongoing process, is what I'm saying. Religion. Not all of us have it. Many of us do. And it can be very influential in how you view politics. So can the job you have, or the job your parents have, the economic class, the social class you're in. We don't do class very well in the United States, right? We tend to view, the wealthiest of the wealthy, the Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates are rich. There are people who live in the Arcata forest, and then everybody else is middle class. And that's not really true, right? Rightly or wrongly. It's a consequence of capitalism, but it's a consequence we tend to ignore. But whether or not you have a working class background or your parents are both highly educated professionals, this is going to influence how you view the world. So will your friends, right? We tend to gravitate toward people who think like us and have shared experiences with us, right? Which just starts to reinforce reinforce our political leanings. Political conditions can be viewed as an agent of socialization. If you were in high school during the 2016 election and you let's say you really liked Bernie Sanders and you think he got screwed in the primary process, you didn't like Trump, you didn't like either choice in the general election, this could have radicalized you to be more of a leftist. Maybe you consider yourself a right-leaning person, but you didn't like Trump. He wasn't a real conservative. His presidency might make you more conservative, right? So the political conditions can shape how you view the political world around you. Obviously, media as well. I'll talk more about media down the line. And then lastly, events can do this as well. For example, I was probably about your age. I was a junior, maybe, in college when September 11th happened. And it shifted my gears on how I viewed the United States' role in the world, U.S. foreign policy. And then I was in graduate school back in Spain when the U.S. invaded Iraq, and that was I was studying international law too, by the way, and that was an event that really served as an agent of socialization for me. It made me change my way of thinking about, again, the United States and United States foreign policy, United States role in the world. But anyway, going back to family here. And probably the most important singular agent of socialization. Most of us, again, acquire our initial orientation to politics from our family. Our parents don't necessarily teach us about politics, but we absorb what's going on around us even when we're little, right? And often we adapt the political orientation that comes with what we hear from our parents. Not everybody. My dad is a lifelong Republican. My mom is a lifelong Democrat. Good examples. My dad was not a fan of Donald Trump. My mom was not a fan of Hillary Clinton. But when I was young, I really didn't know. I mean, I knew my parents didn't agree on things political, so we didn't really talk a lot about politics when I was a kid. However, I did gravitate more toward my dad and his opinions because he was more vocal about them, and I viewed myself as a good little Republican until about the time I was in graduate school. But anyway, my dad's political ideology shaped me, right? I mean, ideology is a comprehensive way of understanding things political or cultural, a set of assumptions about the way the world and society works or how it ought to work that help us organize our beliefs and information that we receive. It kind of functions as a filter, wrongly, I would say, for the information that comes to us. Most Americans describe their ideology as either liberal or conservative. We talked about the history of the term liberal in the United States a little bit ago. Conservative, I'll talk about in a sec. Most of us, again, share the ideology of our family, unless you come from a house divided, if you will. But generally speaking, here is what conservatives and liberals tend to think. Early in the semester, I gave you a list of, say, political identities that we could generally associate with liberals and conservatives or with Republicans and Democrats. Here is the very broad strokes, overly simplified view on what conservatives and liberals think. Conservatives tend to support the social and economic status quo. They tend not to be in favor of new political formulas and economic arrangements for change. They tend to believe that a large and powerful government is a threat to our freedoms. You might agree with that, and that's great. Liberals tend to think the following, that they tend to support political and social reform, especially on behalf of marginalized minorities. They tend to be in favor of greater government intervention in the economy, expansion of federal social services, and they tend to be more concerned about consumers and the environment. Not all, and not uniformly, but these are broad strokes, right? Continuing with the broad strokes, identity politics. The discussion begins on page 270 of the Lowy text of identity politics. And I like the fact that he does suggest that we take this with a grain of salt. He uses the term simplification in understanding how identity politics works as, say, a filter, a prism through which we view the world around us. But these are distinctive characteristics of group associations that we all carry and that hold, for those individuals, social connections or common values and interests with others in that group. right? This can be psychological, it can be sociological, and this, of course, spills over into the political. Unlike ideologies, Lowy seems to think identities are absolutes, and I don't necessarily think that's the case, right? I mean, you can change your religion. Not many of us do, but we can, and that's going to change how we probably view and experience the political world. Sometimes even folks like me, pretty standard issue white guy, but married to someone who looks to be very white, but from Venezuela, Latina, and we speak Spanish, and the world around us can change when, depending on what language we're speaking with each other when we're out in public, right? I mean, when two middle-aged white people are speaking English, they tend to be treated differently than when the same people speak Spanish, right? Because for some reason we have it in our heads that, if you're speaking Spanish, you're somehow non-white. I don't identify as Hispanic. My wife does, and I through her and through language, which can change, which is not absolute. I don't absolutely have to speak English all the time. I can get a small glimpse into how the world can be experienced differently based on identity politics, right? To zoom in further here to the Latinx community, we should not at all think, it's important, I think, to consider identity politics and how identity and such markers can affect how we experience the political world and is a consequence and part of the process of socialization. I'm by no means saying that all Latinos think this way, or all African Americans think that way, or all white people think the same way, because they don't. We don't. Here you see from the Lowy text, this is page 276, differing numbers in party affiliation within three subgroups of the Latino community at its broadest. Cuban Americans, for lots of reasons going back to the Cold War, the Cuban Revolution, tend to vote Republican. Those numbers can change, and they have bounced over time, but they tend to be much more conservative, Cuban Americans, than other people in the Latinx community in the United States. Mexican Americans can be socially more conservative, yet still tend to vote more so overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. Puerto Ricans, and that has a lot to do with immigration as a political topic, as a political hot potato. Puerto Ricans, of course, are U.S. citizens. The island of Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. So while Puerto Ricans in national elections tend to vote more so for the Democratic candidate, Puerto Rico often has a Republican governor now and again. But immigration doesn't tend to be the most important issue for Puerto Ricans in elections in the United States. So, it's important to consider identity as a marker, as having an important role to play in our political lives, both as individuals and in the aggregate. But do not jump to any conclusions that all people of one community or one group think the same, right? There are other things to consider: partisan identification, national origin, race, ethnicity, gender, religion, geography, etc. Outgroups I'll talk about in a sec, but we can't, again, I can't stress this enough. Don't assume that, say, all women vote one way and all men vote the other, but they're just indicators. Again, Lowy uses the term simplifications to help us better understand the world around us. But the strongest one of these is probably partisan identification. If you tell me you're a Republican, I'm going to assume you vote for the Republican Party. If you are, say, of African descent, born outside of the United States, a woman who is Catholic, who lives in the northeast of the United States, and is a single mother, I'm probably going to gather you vote for one party over the other. But I can't assume that. They're just indicators, right? Simply indicators. Let's look at some of these indicators. Race and public opinion. Obviously, the history of slavery and discrimination in this country is heavy and runs deep. And again, I'm not trying to say that all white people think one way and all people of color think the other, but it might be worth listening to the link here posted in the standalone PowerPoint and then in the module, the 1619 podcast from the New York Times. This was done by a professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. In 2019, she did this to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first slave ship arriving to the United States. This was the 1619 Project, and she talks at great length about the history of slavery and structural racism in the United States. A lot of our Republican friends in Congress have really bashed this. I'm not asking that you agree with it, but if you do listen to it, I think you will find it interesting and informative, especially if you are not a person of color. I highly recommend you give it a listen. If you are a person of color, there's probably a lot that you agree with, especially if you're of African American descent. But there are stark differences in beliefs and preferences among Latinos, Blacks, Asians, whites, etc., Native Americans. I should have added to that list regarding the basic responsibilities of government. But again, to reiterate, not every ethnic group or racial group feels the same way, right? We can just look to this data as indicators of patterns, right? Disagreement among blacks and whites. This is pretty informative. Sadly, I think it's rather indicative of privilege, white privilege in particular, but I'm not going to read through the entire list here. This is on page 273 of the 16th edition. But you can see the third one down here. Too much attention is paid to race. Black respondents, 12%. Hispanic respondents, which could be black or white, by the way, or more indigenous extract, 27%. White people, 50%. Too much attention is paid to race. 50% of white people claim this. I think this is pretty indicative, again, of white privilege. The following point as well. My race is central to my identity. Right? If you're white and you say this 15%, that might make you a white supremacist. But the fact that it isn't a concern or central to 85% of white respondents, again, I think is freedom from thinking of that, which is in effect white privilege, right? So last one I'll mention is the last point on here. America has not gone far enough to ensure equality between blacks and whites. Black respondents 78%, white respondents 37%. Again, this is clearly this data is demonstrative of different ways of perceiving the world, right? There it is. Not really much to say about this. The data I think speaks for themselves, but you can read through the rest of this from the textbook or pause this and look at it now. But anyway. Greater point is racial and ethnic identity is influential to one's political attitudes. Here you see a sign that says migration reform now for our families. Time is now to keep families united, taken during the Trump presidency. Migration reform now. Given the data that we've seen, my guess is the gent holding the sign here is likely not Puerto Rican. Again, because of the differences in experience and status, Puerto Ricans as U.S. citizens tend not to view migration as the most important factor or most salient political issue, we'll say, in their lives, right? Things can vary. You shouldn't just assume that the entire Latinx community feels the exact same way about any given political issue, right? Gender is another variable. Distinctive pattern of voting behavior reflecting the differences in views between women and men. The term for this is the gender gap, which has been an enduring feature of American elections for some time, with women consistently voting more Democratic and men voting more Republican. That's not to say that all women vote for Democrats and all men vote for Republicans. That's not true. We know this. But we see women in greater numbers voting for the Democratic Party and men in greater numbers voting for the Republican Party. The hyperlink here will take you to a National Public Radio story on looking at the gender gap in October of 2020 in the run-up to the presidential elections of that year. It's pretty informative, worth a listen. So pause here, go look at that under the Canvas module, or listen to it later on your own time. But if you're at all interested in this as a political issue, I recommend it. And we see evidence of the gender gap regarding war and peace. This, again, straight out of the Lowy chapter, which is the only chapter to read for this section here, page 277. Most recently, the Trump administration used a drone in Iraq to kill the Iranian Major General Soleimani in 2020, men approving of that action by 20% over women, right? Say sending of ground troops to fight Islamist militants of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, 2015, men approving more than women. Men tend to be more in favor of using force. And this goes back to, say, the 2003 invasion of Iraq or the war against Iraq in 1991 even. You see that men consistently tend to be more in favor of using force. The Republican Party tends to be more in favor of using force over the Democratic Party, generally speaking, over time. And there we start to see a pattern in this issue with these parties regarding gender, right? It's not hard and fast, but we can start to see patterns. Speaking of, here's data from the 2012 presidential election. You can see this comes from a different textbook that I teach from, and I realize that the numbers are increasingly old, but not by that much, and they still tell us the same thing, right? You see that women favored Obama over Mitt Romney, who ran in 2012 against Obama running for re-election by 10%. The gulf was a little narrower with men, but you can still see that that's there. Race, obviously, ethnicity, whatever you care to call it, influences how one votes. Whites tend to vote more, in this case, by 20 points. That's arguably overwhelmingly for Romney over Obama. African Americans more overwhelmingly, 93-6, Obama over Romney. And you can see effects with other ethnic groups too. Age is an issue. The younger you are, the more likely you are to vote for Democrats in the United States. The older you are, by 10 points in 2012 at least, in the presidential election, the older you are, the more likely you are to vote for Republicans. Older people vote in higher numbers as well. Income is pretty clearly a variable. If you earn a lot less than $50,000, you're way more likely to vote for Democrats. If you earn more than $100,000 a year, you're quite a bit more likely to vote for Republicans. Education is an issue, is a variable, so is religion, right? So I don't need to go through all these point by point. You can pause this and look at this on your own, but we can start to see patterns, right? It's not that just because you're a woman of a certain age with a certain education level doesn't mean you have to vote a certain way. Obviously not. But again, we start to see patterns. Religion is another variable at play here. This shapes our values and beliefs and serves as a strong marker of identity, right? It's an agent of socialization and an identity marker. Often begins as an agent of socialization because those of us who are brought up religious don't even really realize that religion marks our identity until later, right? Early on, it's merely just an agent of socialization. Where we live also molds our sense of identity, and sometimes there's a lot of overlap here. We can hear someone speak and start to make assumptions. State pride, right? I know a lot of proud Californians. I just moved to Texas, and boy, let me tell you, state pride is everywhere around here. But you could be from a conservative state but live in an urban area, and that can be an issue. I'm from Kansas City, Kansas, and my parents grew up in rural Kansas. I did not. I grew up between Kansas City and Madrid, both urban settings, and this has an effect on how I see and interact with the world. History, of course, is pretty important, and that can be intrinsically linked to region as well. But region and religion are often linked too. And you can see this here. This is a map from a geography textbook that I teach from now and again, not from the Lowy book, but you can see down in the southeast of the United States, overwhelmingly Protestant, particularly Baptist and Methodist, with pockets of Catholicism and Judaism down here, the Star of David. Catholics concentrated in the northeast and the southwest. Mormons basically run the state of Utah and spill over into other neighboring states. A lot of Lutherans up top in the north of the country. But that doesn't mean that everyone votes the same way. However, we do know the South to be pretty staunchly Republican, the Northeast to be pretty staunchly Democratic. Things are a bit in flux in the Mountain West. The West Coast tends to be pretty Democratic as well. But believe you me, there is some overlap that explains how and why the southern states in the southeast tend to be overwhelmingly Republican. Utah, Mormons tend to be pretty socially conservative, and so on and so forth. Right? Lutherans tend not to be so socially conservative, even some of the more religious ones of them. I was brought up pretty Lutheran, but very much did not feel like my religion at the time influenced my political leanings. But that's everybody's different. Everybody's socialization is different. Some of us might be socialized, say, if you're Catholic, to think that it's impossible to be Catholic and pro-abortion. There are a lot of Catholics that hold this opinion. I'm not here to tell them that it's wrong, but you can indeed be Catholic and pro-abortion, or pro-choice. The current president of the United States is both Catholic and pro-choice. So you can be. It's just that some people within any religious grouping or any social grouping of any kind might be pretty keen on telling others what they can and can't do, or should and shouldn't do, is maybe the better term. You shouldn't be Catholic and pro-abortion. Shifting gears to something much more silly. This is region and language here. This is a map that I use in my aforementioned geography class. Generic names for soft drinks by county. And you can see that this varies across the country. I come from pop country. Coke is pop. Pepsi is pop. Mountain Dew is pop. That's what we say in Kansas City, most of us. California is soda country, right? Everything fizzy you can broadly call soda. Let's pick on the people from the South. Why don't we? In the South, pockets of the South, but generally speaking, in large swaths of the South, the term Coke is used for all things fizzy, right? Pepsi is Coke. Coke is Coke. Mountain Dew is Coke. Fanta is Coke. That's crazy. I think that's just crazy. That's just me, though. We're all entitled to our opinion. But point is, United States is a pretty big country. And given even something as silly as soft drinks can be regionally diverse, right? And we can find patterns, as we can with something much more serious like religion, right? Anyway, getting back to more things serious, let's think about outgroups. Some groups are defined not by who they are, but who they are not. And these are outgroups. And there's a laundry list. This is not an exhaustive list. African Americans, women, Catholic, Jews, Latinos, the LGBTQ community, divorced fathers, atheists, urbanites, the working poor. All of these are people who can be viewed as outside of the mainstream of, middle to upper middle class white males, straight males. Let's add that, who are likely Protestant. But anything that's outside that norm. Again, groups who are defined by what they are not, we can call outgroups. And outgroups can be very influential. They can be very marginalized, and they can be pretty influential in the political system and political process. But it is important to point out that political, social, and economic discrimination is not limited only to race, ethnicity, gender, and religion. Right now, we can talk about economic discrimination, and I think. Me personally, just speaking off the cuff, the consequences of the coronavirus, who suffered from it in greater numbers, who was more likely to catch it, who was more likely to die from it, affected the working poor across racial and ethnic and gender and religious lines, right? So again, discrimination is not limited to only the main areas in which we think of it, right? Can definitely be, we can definitely talk of economic discrimination, which disproportionately affects people of color, yes, women, yes, but it also affects poor white males too. How can we change this? I would argue that it would help if more of us were better informed, right? The problem is that public opinion is only voiced by people who, generally speaking, are informed, or at least feel like they're informed. But few Americans devote sufficient time, energy, or attention to politics to really understand the issues. This frustrates me as a political scientist, but yet at the same time, when I was in college and even shortly after, I wasn't as informed as right now I feel like I should have been then. This has a lot to do with the cost of gathering information. This can be very high. if you're part of the working poor and you're working 3 jobs and working 60 hours a week and you don't have health care, you might view that the time you would need to inform yourself to make good political decisions is not worth it. The benefits don't pay off for the time you need to dedicate to inform yourself, right? However, we can think of examples where low levels of political information can really be harmful to groups of any people, any group of people. You might think, well, my economic situation in life has to do with the fact that Republicans aren't in power, so I'm going to vote for the Republicans because I think I'll be better off if Republicans control the White House and Congress, and then Republicans come in like they did in 2017 and pass tax cuts that were very much skewed to benefit the wealthy, right? That might not help you in the long run. Your lack of political knowledge might hurt you in the long run. Might or might not. But anyway, I think if we had a better grasp of how the U.S. political system worked, we could make better choices based on our values and beliefs and what we want for ourselves. And again, this is a very apolitical statement. I'm not endorsing one party over another by any stretch of the imagination. What I am going to do is pass judgment on the person holding this sign. We see government, keep your hands off my Medicare with the hammer and sickle, which is a symbol of communism. And in red here, don't steal from Medicare to support socialized medicine. What this person doesn't seem to understand is that Medicare is socialized medicine, right? Medicare is a government-funded program that provides health care to the elderly, right? So if you're over 65, probably, I doubt any of you are, maybe someone out there is, but you probably know someone who is over 65, and that person is likely a beneficiary of Medicare, and that person, in practice, is kind of a socialist, right? Because this is a form of socialized medicine, right? So this sign is pretty indicative of someone who lacks the political knowledge to back up what they're expressing visually on their little sign here. How about shaping our opinions? Governments attempt to influence our beliefs, but their groups, the government's efforts are counteracted by interest groups, media, and politicians opposed to those in power, right? So maybe not so much in North Korea. There, the government pretty much tells everybody what to think. But in a country like the United States, where we have freedom of speech and expression and assembly and so on and so forth, there's a marketplace of ideas, if you will. Presidents tend to have the upper hand in this going around trying to shape the opinions of individuals. Presidents can go public. We talked about this when we talked about the presidency. Presidents can get on television whenever they want and present their ideas to the public and to try to get the public to follow their initiatives. They're not always successful. This is very true. I'm thinking of a boring example from 2004, which I realize you were probably very young then, but President Bush was running for re-election, was successful, defeated John Kerry in the 2004 presidential election, and immediately then said, you know what I want to do? I want to privatize part of Social Security. Not a large, it was only like 4% of Social Security. He wanted to basically turn over to private investment interests to maximize the investment of that money, and public opinion was very much against it, and I think in the longer run, that was probably a good idea because at least what happened in 2008 and beyond, the economy basically tanked, the stock market tanked, and Social Security would have been up a pretty big creek if President Bush had been successful, then President W. Bush had been successful. So presidents are not always successful in going public, right? That's where I'm going with this. How about private groups? Private groups seek to influence latent and unorganized individuals to support their cause, right? Not all of us have very strong opinions. Some of us do on things like, say, gun control. Those of us who do hold a pretty strong opinion are a minority either way. But private groups try to get those of us who are somewhere in the middle to support their cause. Groups and individuals with more money, institutional support, and skill will have more success. I'll return to the March for Our Lives movement. founded in 2018, a month after a pretty bloody school shooting. And the March for Our Lives, I'll call them kids because they were high school students at the time, were going against the National Rifle Association, right, the NRA, which has existed since the mid-1800s. It has a lot more money, a lot more institutional support, a lot closer relationship with the Republican Party, and thus a lot more skill, and has been a lot more successful in impeding any form of gun control measure going through Congress, right? So private groups are important, but not all private groups are the same in their resources and their reach, okay? This is all, of course, shaped and conditioned a bit by the media, because the mass media are the conduits through which most politically relevant information flows to the public. We can talk of traditional media sources, newspapers, radio, television. This is what we call the legacy media, or Sarah Palin, former governor of Arkansas, former nominee for the vice presidency in 2008, with John McCain, called it the lamestream media. Which is supplemented today by social media and the internet. I should take the word internet out there. I mean, social media by definition uses the internet. But we learn from the media either actively by seeking out news on our own, or passively by absorbing news through entertainment. There are a lot of ways that can happen, right? Absorbing through entertainment. I'll touch on that in a sec. Newspapers and magazines are things you probably never touch, but they're the oldest forms of printed political communication. Print journalism, I think, is pretty good. It allows for greater context, depth, and analysis. You can do this. You can have greater context, depth, and analysis with a podcast or a YouTube video, but it really kind of depends. A lot of podcasts and YouTube videos are made for people with shorter attention spans, right? I subscribe to several magazines, The Atlantic and The New Yorker being two of them, and Foreign Affairs, that deal with long-form journalism, right? I can get a magazine and read a story that's 12, 15, 20 pages long, which is not the same as reading a headline scrolling through Twitter or Facebook, right? So print journalism, I think, still has great value, but it's increasingly underappreciated as it competes with other forms of news, right? Which the social media and the internet threaten the viability of print media. This link here will take you to a defense of print media by Hassan Minhaj, who used to have a program on Netflix called Patriot Act. I've posted a couple of clips. I'll post a couple more throughout the semester, but he's definitely worth watching. Give this a pause, watch that now, or pull it up later. But I highly recommend it. Broadcast media. This is, again, the legacy or lamestream media. Television, big after World War II, the baby boom, but then we only had three networks, CBS, NBC, ABC, later PBS. Then cable news came about in the 80s and grew increasingly through the end of the 20th century. Radio has long been important. Traditionally been more important for mobilizing American conservatives. Left-wing radio has been much less successful. The hyperlink here will take you to a Stephen Colbert satire bit on making fun of right-wing talk radio in the form of Alex Jones. But there used to be a left-wing outfit called Air America that failed miserably. Many of our conservative friends will tell you that National Public Radio is left-wing radio, but I would beg to differ. There's data that can show that this is really not the case. But anyway, I tend to follow National Public Radio more than any other singular news source. I have here, I believe their photographs are both in the text here. This is Sean Hannity and Rachel Maddow. Their photos are together on page 289. I say political commentators here. They're not really journalists. Both have television shows, hour-long nightly shows, Monday through Friday. Sean Hannity on the left here. He is a pretty staunch Republican and conservative, and Rachel Maddow might tell you she's maybe not a staunch Democrat, but she would tell you she's a staunch progressive. Both of them have, again, news programs, but they're not journalists. They're not presenting the news. They're filtering the news for us, for the viewers. I kind of like Rachel Maddow, but I don't listen or watch very often because I know that what I'm getting is her take on the news, not the news itself. And more of us turn to people like Sean Hannity or like Rachel Maddow to reinforce what our political opinions are. This is socialization for adults, right? Once you reach a certain stage in life, you feel like your political ideals are pretty fixed, and then you seek out news sources, what you think are news sources, to reinforce what you think. I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. A lot of us do it, but it's you need to be aware when you're hearing an opinion over straight news. Okay, and again, I feel like National Public Radio does a pretty good job of distinguishing those two things, right? I know when I'm hearing an opinion piece because they tell me over a hard news piece. But what has helped to blur the lines between the two is the stupid internet, which is great, but as new technology for the dissemination of news and information. But again, I think it's user error in large part. We don't seem to know when we're scrolling through social media if we're looking at an opinion, or if we're looking at hard news, right? The problem is a lot of internet news sites aggregate news collected by other media. I'm thinking right now of, say, like the Huffington Post, which presents itself as a news website, but it really just aggregates news collected by other media. Sort of regurgitates an article and then provides you a link at the end to the original article in the Washington Post, right? I prefer to just go to the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or what have you. But politicians increasingly communicate with voters through social networking sites, especially Facebook and Twitter. Here's a snapshot of the former president's Twitter feed here. He's, of course, been booted off both Twitter and Facebook. The thinking is for inciting violence on the 6th of January of 2021. I don't know if I agree or disagree with this, but the fact of the matter is, social media outlets are not open platforms. When we say, I have a right to free speech, it's free speech before the government. The government can't tell you what to do, but a social media website can. Right? You agree to the terms and conditions, and if you violate those, then you don't have a right to have a Facebook account, is what I'm saying. Whether or not booting major political figures off of social media is the right thing to do, I don't know. I reserve comment, but the fact of the matter is, I understand that can be done. Main sources for news, right? Most of us still get our news from TV, but that probably has a lot to do with the fact that this is a society that is increasingly getting older. Older people still follow news on TV. Probably in 20 or 30 years, I'm sure online will be well ahead of TV. This is on page 286 if you're flipping through the text. Larson is one of those rare people, about 1 in 10, who gets his news mostly from the radio, but I also read something called newspapers and magazines. I don't read newspapers very much in the United States. I will electronically, the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Kansas City Star, where I'm from, but I tend to use the internet to read the newspaper, which is worth pointing out. When I'm abroad, especially when I'm back in Madrid or Lisbon, I buy newspapers almost every day, which again is pretty rare. Most of us don't. So here's news sources by age. Again, this is straight out of the old textbook here, page 290, if you're flipping around. You can see the younger you are, the more likely you are to get your news online, and the older you are, the more likely you are to get your news from television. So there's that there. I don't know the distinction here between social media and online, because to be on social media, you have to be online. So I don't know. We'd have to look at the data here from the Pew Research Center to understand methodologically what the distinction is. But anyway, if we were to combine the two, we would just see that online/social media would be much higher than television. Here's what we're talking about passively absorbing the news that came up a couple slides ago. Where do Americans get political news? I think of blank as a useful way of getting the news, and a majority of us think of Twitter as a good place to get the news. Contrast this with, I mostly see news when I'm on blank for other reasons. And there we see the Facebook factor here, that you might get on Facebook for entertainment reasons, cat videos and pictures of your nieces and nephews or something. And while there, you see things, you see news. But again, Facebook is not a political news website, right? The news you see on Facebook is a consequence of your friends and what your friends choose to post, right? So never think of Facebook as a news website or as a source of news. The source is the person who's posting the link, and by extension, the link itself. But if we trust our friends and our friends post untrustworthy things, then we might erroneously think what we're looking at is trustworthy news, but it's not necessarily the case. That's why Larson's been off of Facebook for quite some time, and I feel better for it. I do not feel less informed. I maybe don't know what my friends in Porto in northern Portugal are up to right now, but I don't really care, and I can always message them and ask if I really want to know. But anyway, freedom of the press. I'm almost done here. Included in the First Amendment, prior restraint refers to efforts by the government to present publication of material deemed harmful or libelous. In the age of social media, that's pretty hard to do. But the fact of the matter is, the Supreme Court decided some time ago in 1931 that the government really does not have any authority to tell a publisher what to publish or what not to publish. So this is different in the United States than several other democratic countries I know. The Spanish government can impede the publication of material deemed harmful to the monarchy still to this day. But in the United States, we're pretty free to say what we want, for better, for worse. And then, 21st century, whatever we say, for better, for worse, gets injected into the echo chamber of social media. And we need to constantly be on call to think about the consequences. But more scientifically, if you will, more theoretically, and this is my last slide. It's kind of an odd spot to end, but this is how Lowy ends the chapter, so I will too. But what the media does, or the effects of the media, broadly speaking, can set the agenda, can prime us, and can frame issues for us, which really sets how we interpret the world around us, right? The media has the power to bring attention to particular issues and problems. That's called setting the agenda. I think the media did a good job of this, both left-leaning and right-leaning media in the early 2000s after September 11th, to set the agenda regarding the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Very few media outlets in their editorial pages were against it. Very few hard news outlets were willing to publish any data evidence critical of the U.S. invasion of Iraq to come. Priming is the process of preparing the public to take a particular view of an event or a political actor. There's some overlap between agenda setting and priming. Our attention can be pulled to particular problems, and then priming prepares us for the event itself. Framing, and there's some overlapping between priming and framing, but framing is the power of the media to influence how events and issues are interpreted. And again, we turn to the media as adults, and we tend to seek out media that agenda set, prime, and frame based on what we want, right? And if we don't like what we hear from one media outlet, we find another that tells us more or less what we want to hear. And we often have to go to political commentators for that. And when we think those commentators are journalists, I think that's a danger to democracy and to ourselves. But anyway, I want you to take away from this my encouragement of you to think critically about the news around you, be selective about what news you follow, learn to distinguish between an opinion and a fact, and know that a lot of news sources will present both to you, news and fact, and know when to distinguish when you're reading an editorial and when you're reading a news article, and when you're being primed and framed, and when the media outlet you choose to follow might have an agenda. Anyway, just use your heads, be smart, be aware, look at the world around you, think about your own socialization. Please do that as a take home. But anyway, I've gone on way longer than I wanted to. Bye-bye. Sorry.